In the vast theatre of conflict that shaped the destiny of Rome, the Battle of Thapsus stands out as a pivotal moment. Picture the scene, armor gleaming under the intense African sun, colossal armies preparing for a clash that would define the future of one of the greatest civilizations in history. This battle was not just an armed conflict, but the culmination of a political and personal struggle that had torn Rome apart. At the center of it all was the legendary Julius Caesar, a man who defied not only his adversaries, but also fate itself. Caesar was not just a general. He was a brilliant strategist, known for turning impossible odds into glorious victories. After defeating Pompey at the historic Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC, he faced a new challenge. The remnants of the Republican Party, loyal to Pompey, could not accept their defeat and fled to Africa, where they found support in King Juba I of Numidia. This king was no ordinary ally. He was a powerful monarch with vast resources, an enemy who posed a real threat to Caesar's plan to consolidate his absolute power. Africa then became the new battleground, a continent rich in resources and strategic for any army seeking control of Rome. For the Republicans, led by Metellus Scipio and Juba I, it was their last bastion of hope. If they could stop Caesar there, they could regain their lost power and restore the Senate. For Caesar, on the other hand, Africa represented an opportunity to end, once and for all, the civil war that was eating away at the Republic. He knew that a defeat there would mean not only the loss of his influence, but also the destruction of his legend. Now imagine this: Caesar's army crossing the Mediterranean, facing the logistical difficulties of landing on hostile lands. The conditions were challenging: unrelenting heat, scarce food and water, and an enemy who knew the terrain well. Yet Caesar did not back down. He knew that every decision he made there would echo for generations. Upon arriving in Africa, he quickly established alliances with the local peoples and secured a base of operations. This was a characteristic Caesarian move, to anticipate his enemies and turn adverse conditions to his advantage. Metellus Scipio, on the other hand, was not alone. He assembled a formidable army, reinforced not only by Juba I's troops, but also by mercenaries and veterans of the Civil War. The Republican army was large and relied on the advantage of the terrain and the skill of its generals. But there was something they underestimated: Caesar's determination. He was not just fighting for Rome, he was fighting to become Rome. And here's a curiosity that many don't know. Before marching to Thapsus, Caesar wrote a letter to his soldiers, emphasizing that this was not just a war against men, but against time. He knew that his enemies had not only swords and spears, but also the support of a narrative that tried to paint him as a tyrant. Every battle Caesar won was also a battle for his reputation, a step towards cementing his image as the savior of Rome. So, as Caesar's army approached Thapsus, the tension grew. Both sides knew that this confrontation would be decisive. Would Caesar's genius be enough to overcome the odds, or would the Republicans be able to turn the tables and restore the power of the Senate? That is the story we are about to uncover. Now it's your turn. Can you imagine what was going through the minds of Caesar's soldiers at that moment? What must it have felt like to be part of an army that was changing the course of history? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your opinion matters, because you too are part of this journey through the past. And stay tuned, because in the next part, we will discover how Caesar dealt with the deadly traps of Ruspina and proved that genius is forged under pressure. The stage was set, and the sands of Africa became witness to one of the most ingenious war strategies of all time. At Ruspina, a small coastal town in the province of Africa Proconsularis, the fate of Caesar and his army seemed uncertain. Surrounded by hostile forces led by generals loyal to Pompey and supported by Juba I, the king of Numidia, Caesar faced a desperate situation. What seemed to be the beginning of the end for the great Roman general turned out to be a shining example of military cunning and perseverance. Ruspina was not just a battlefield, it was an arena where strategy and courage were tested at every turn. Caesar, with a small contingent, was overwhelmingly outnumbered. His enemies, aware of this, intended to surround him and annihilate his troops before he could receive reinforcements. However, underestimating Caesar was always a fatal mistake. Even in the first clashes, it became clear that Caesar's legions were in a critical position. His heavy infantry, accustomed to fighting in compact formations, faced a new threat. The Numidians, with their incredibly agile light cavalry and skilled archers, dominated the surrounding area with quick and accurate attacks. They sought not direct confrontation, but to wear down the Romans with a war of attrition. It was a tactic that could easily demoralize any ordinary commander, but Caesar was far from ordinary. Amid the chaos, he demonstrated masterful control. Caesar's first move was to reorganize his troops into flexible defensive formations known as the orbis, or circle formation. This structure allowed the soldiers to protect each other while repelling enemy advances in all directions, but it was not enough. He needed something else: time. Time to consolidate his positions, to communicate with his allies, and to wait for reinforcements that were on the way. Caesar also knew that in order to turn the tide, it was essential to understand the movements of his enemy. During the nights, while the Roman camp rested in tense silence, his scouts watched every step of the Numidian and Pompeian troops. This information allowed Caesar to anticipate ambushes and avoid situations that could lead to complete defeat. The most critical moment came when Caesar, sensing the exhaustion of his men and the constant pressure of the enemy, decided to execute a bold maneuver. He ordered a feigned retreat, a risky tactic that could either save or destroy his army. While his troops retreated in an organized manner, the enemy forces, confident that they had Caesar cornered, broke formation to pursue the Romans. It was at this moment that Caesar showed why he was one of the greatest military geniuses in history. He gave the signal for a surprise counterattack. His legions, which had been pretending to flee, suddenly turned against their pursuers. The confusion in the enemy ranks was devastating, and the Romans gained a crucial breathing space to regroup. Behind these maneuvers lies a detail that is often overlooked: the absolute trust that the Roman soldiers had in their leader. Even in a desperate situation, Caesar never showed doubt or weakness. His presence on the battlefield was magnetic. He walked among the soldiers, encouraging them personally, calling many by name and reminding them of what they had already achieved together. This inspiring leadership not only kept morale high, but also created an unbreakable unity among the troops. Another fascinating aspect of this campaign was how Caesar dealt with the logistical challenges. Isolated in a foreign land, he had to ensure that his troops had food and water supplies while being under constant attack. To do this, he used local resources strategically, organizing foraging missions and ensuring that his men not only survived, but remained strong for the upcoming battles. Meanwhile, reinforcements were on the way. Caesar's support came not only from additional soldiers, but also from his naval fleet, which was able to intercept enemy supplies and ensure that the Romans were not completely cut off. Each day that passed was a victory for Caesar, as he moved closer to the moment when he could take complete control of the situation. This period at Ruspina revealed not only Caesar's military genius, but also his mental resilience. He knew that his reputation in Rome depended on his ability to emerge victorious from this campaign. And more than that, he knew that every soldier at his side also placed their hope of survival in him. It was this pressure that drove him to be so ruthless in his decisions. By the end of this period, Ruspina became a classic example of how strategy and courage can overcome overwhelming odds. Caesar, not only managed to prevent the collapse of his forces, but also turned the tables on his enemies, making it clear that he would not be defeated so easily. This is where our story takes a thrilling turn. Can you imagine what was to come when Caesar finally regrouped and advanced towards Thapsus? Before we get to that decisive moment, share your thoughts on what you would have done in this dire situation if you were on Caesar's side. Would you have the courage to continue, or would you hesitate in the face of so many enemies? Your point of view is essential to understanding how this story impacts not only books, but also the way we see challenges today. And get ready, because the confrontation at Thapsus holds even more surprises in store. Imagine the scenario: the horizon stretched out above the battlefield where the future of Rome was about to be decided. Thapsus, a fortified city, was under Roman siege. The scorching heat of the African desert was oppressive, but Caesar, with his army at his side, showed no signs of weakening. On the other side, Metellus Scipio, a veteran leader of the Republican resistance, had prepared to prolong the confrontation, building fortifications and expecting a long and exhausting siege. But Caesar, always ahead, knew that time was his enemy. The siege itself was nothing new to the Romans. Caesar had faced such situations before, but Thapsus demanded something more. He knew that delay could undermine not only his forces, but the morale of the army. At the same time, the terrain surrounding the city offered its own advantages and challenges. The battlefield was full of steep slopes and valleys that could become allies or enemies, depending on how the troops positioned themselves. For Caesar, every move had to be precise, every action meticulously calculated. What many don't know is that the siege of Thapsus was not just a battle of brute force. It was a matter of intelligence. Caesar studied the terrain, observed how the city was positioned, and identified the weakest points in Scipio's defenses. As much as the Optimates had been confident in the strength of their defenses, Caesar knew that wars are not won with walls alone, but with ruthless control of time and strategy. To understand the impact of this phase of the battle, one must look at what happened before the direct confrontation. Caesar knew that Scipio's Republican forces were strong, but he also knew that every extra second at Thapsus could be fatal. His goal was not just to encircle, but to force a confrontation that would lead to the final defeat of his enemy. He began with what seemed like a simple diversionary move, but which was in reality a brilliant maneuver. The first part of Caesar's plan was to create a false impression of weakness. By simulating a partial retreat of his forces, he lulled Scipio into feeling secure. This move, although bold, caused the enemy to approach without knowing what was coming. This was a game of psychology, in which Caesar once again proved himself a master of manipulating perceptions. However, the masterstroke was yet to come. When Scipio, confident of his superiority, advanced to attack the most exposed Roman positions, Caesar launched the decisive attack. In an unexpected move, he directed his forces at the weakest points in Thapsus's defenses, catching the enemy by surprise. It was a surgical maneuver in which precision and timing became Caesar's sharpest weapons. The moment Caesar's troops advanced, the terrain was transformed into a bloody battlefield. The impact of the clash between the Roman and Republican forces was immense. Scipio's troops were unprepared for the speed and intensity of the attack. Every line of defense that Scipio had carefully established was quickly broken by the determination and organization of Caesar's legions. The direct confrontation at Thapsus was not just a battle of swords and shields, it was a game of nerves, with each commander trying to anticipate the other's moves. Caesar's ability to manipulate the pace of the battle proved crucial. When Scipio's forces began to falter, it was Caesar's turn to press even harder, advancing with ferocity and giving the enemy no chance to regroup. It is important to note that while the Optimates were fighting for a last breath of resistance, Caesar's army was completely focused. The discipline and training of the Roman legions was evident in every move. There was no room for error. Every soldier knew his role, and every commander, including Caesar, was determined to leave nothing to chance. In addition to traditional military strategy, Caesar distinguished himself by using unconventional tactics during the siege and the confrontation. One example was the use of cavalry units, which instead of attacking directly, were used to destabilize enemy supply lines. These agile and fast cavalry units surrounded critical points, preventing any attempt to escape or reinforce Scipio's forces. It was a constant pressure, which undermined the enemy's morale with every move. But Caesar's greatest asset, and what most frightened his enemies, was his ability to act decisively. When the battle seemed to be tied, he did not hesitate to make a radical move. He personally led a frontal assault, something unusual for Roman commanders, who preferred to plan and wait for their subordinates to execute. This created a shockwave in the enemy lines, which were accustomed to a more traditional type of battle. The crucial moment of the confrontation came when the Optimates, already tired and out of options, began to lose control. Scipio's forces were scattered, and disorder set in among the enemy lines. The siege turned into a bloodbath, where the lack of organization in Scipio's ranks was the key to Caesar's victory. Even after the victory, the scene at Thapsus was a devastated field. But make no mistake, what seemed like an easy victory for Caesar was, in fact, the result of years of preparation, study, and an incredible ability to adapt to the battlefield. Caesar's decision to force the confrontation rather than engaging in a prolonged siege was a risky move, but one that ultimately proved to be victorious. Now, imagine for a moment what followed the confrontation. The Roman soldiers, tired but victorious, began to collect the wreckage of the battle. But what do you think would have happened next? The reaction of Caesar's army after a victory like this was not only a matter of celebrating, but also of reorganizing and reflecting on the next steps. Want to know more about the fate of these soldiers after the massacre at Thapsus? Keep watching, because the consequences of this victory were more complex than anyone could have imagined. After the battle at Thapsus, where Caesar's legions emerged victorious, the battlefield was filled with an eerie silence, a stark contrast to the intensity of the fighting that had taken place moments before. Victory was now in the hands of the Romans, but the question that hung over the future of Rome and Caesar was, what would come next? What to do with this newly acquired power? Contrary to what many people think, the victory at Thapsus did not mean that Caesar was completely at peace with his situation. As much as he had defeated his enemies and consolidated his authority, the situation in Rome was far from simple. The Republic was in ruins, corroded by centuries of mistrust and internal divisions. What Caesar needed, more than anything else, was to reassert his control, to ensure that there would be no more challenges to his leadership. This process of reconstruction was not only political, but also psychological. Caesar, more than ever, was aware that his name and his actions would be remembered for generations. He knew that, in order to ensure his immortality, he could not simply be a victorious military commander. He needed to be seen as a great statesman, someone capable of uniting Rome, healing the wounds of the Republic, and creating a legacy that would stand the test of time. And it is at this moment that a fascinating aspect of Caesar's personality emerges: his ability to know when to act. He did not rush. Rather than seeking immediate legitimacy, he set about smoothing over tensions, rebuilding alliances that might otherwise have been fractured. Had it not been for his skill at political maneuvering, the victory at Thapsus might have been nothing more than an empty military victory, with no real consequences for the future of Rome. Caesar knew that a leader is not built on victories on the battlefield alone. After the victory at Thapsus, he made a decision that seemed simple but was revolutionary for the time. Rather than forcing a new cycle of wars, he used his position to initiate a series of political and social reforms. He knew that true victory would not be defined solely by the conquest of Thapsus, but by the transformation it could bring to the daily lives of Romans. Among the reforms that began to emerge were those focused on the legal field. Caesar implemented changes that aimed to simplify the legal system, a move that was seen as an attempt to make the Roman Empire more accessible and fair to all. It was more than a political strategy. It was a way to win the hearts and minds of the Roman population, especially the lower classes, who often found themselves on the margins of politics. In addition, Caesar made a point of reinforcing his role as absolute leader. He knew he needed the acceptance of the people and the elites, but he also needed to show his strength. The appointment of allies to prominent positions, the distribution of land to veterans, and the strengthening of the Roman legions were measures that not only consolidated his power, but also ensured that the army remained loyal and ready for any new threat. Although Caesar's reforms had great support among the soldiers and the popular classes, the Roman elite was increasingly uncomfortable with the increasing centralization of power. Some saw Caesar as a direct threat to the freedom of the Republic, and while he made seemingly conciliatory decisions, the shadow of his enemies was not far behind. Internal opposition intensified, and Caesar's figure began to divide public opinion in Rome. In the Senate, the more conservative members saw his actions as a direct threat to the legacy of the Republic. This polarization made it clear that, as charismatic and skilled a leader as Caesar had proven himself, he would never be fully accepted by the most powerful circles in Rome. This was the price he paid for trying to transform Rome forever. But Caesar, with his political astuteness, knew that the risk of being deposed or even assassinated was ever present. He needed to act more wisely than ever, striking a delicate balance between force and diplomacy, always aware that the line between being seen as a hero and being remembered as a tyrant could blur at any moment. In Caesar's mind, the final battle would not be fought with swords or spears, but with history. He knew that to be remembered as more than just a military leader, he needed to leave a lasting legacy. The victory at Thapsus, while impressive, was only one step on that path. Caesar's legacy would be built through his actions, but it would also be secured by controlling the narrative. He made sure to record his history and his victories so that future generations of Romans would remember him as the great unifier of the Republic. More than any other Roman leader, Caesar knew that controlling memory was a supreme power, one that would transcend any government or empire. For him, being remembered positively by history was the true victory. After all, in the heart of a leader like Caesar, the desire for immortality is as great as the need for control. Now, after following every step of this journey, imagine what would have happened if Caesar had acted differently or if the opposition had been stronger. What do you think could have changed in the history of Rome and Caesar? Would the Roman Empire have been different if he had chosen a different path? We are curious to know your opinion. That is the beauty of history, the possibility of imagining what could have been, of looking back at the decisive moments and reflecting on the paths taken. If you have ever imagined yourself in Caesar's shoes, making these difficult decisions, share them with us. Or who knows, do you see another Roman leader who would have taken a completely different path? Now get ready, because the real turnaround is yet to come. What will happen to Caesar and the Republic after all these reforms? The path to eternity is being paved, but not everyone around him is willing to let it happen so easily. As Caesar established himself as the undisputed leader of Rome, his victories and reforms began to bear visible fruit. The Republic, still in tension, seemed to be heading towards unprecedented stability. However, While he was winning hearts and minds in the army and among the common people, a shadow of discontent began to form in the corridors of power. Rome, as always, was a city of intrigue, where alliances were quickly formed and dissolved. And one thing Caesar knew well was that a ruler could never fully trust the Roman elite. The Senate, with its long history of power, had difficulty accepting that control was concentrated in a single person. For many senators, Caesar's rise represented not only a political threat, but a direct challenge to the traditional Roman way of life. Caesar, aware of this hostility, tried to balance his relationship with the Roman nobility. His gestures of generosity, his reforms, and even his policy of exalting the plebeians were attempts to mitigate resentment. But this did not prevent more conservative senators from meeting secretly to question his leadership. In their discussions, one doubt persisted. To what extent could Caesar control Rome without becoming an absolute dictator? The tension, although palpable, remained hidden. A plot that unfolded at secret dinners in the shadows of the Roman elite, where Caesar's enemies were growing stronger. These enemies were not only senators, but also military figures who saw Caesar as a threat to the autonomy of the Roman army. Although he was adored by the legions, some officers began to question whether his empire of reforms did not represent a dangerous centralization. Although Caesar was skilled in the art of politics and tried to win the sympathy of the people, not all Romans shared his vision for the future. The transition from a republic to an empire, however gradual and discreet, shook the structures of Roman society. Those accustomed to the republican system, where power was distributed among the Senate and other magistrates, viewed Caesar's growing power with suspicion. For them, the idea of a single ruler, even if he was such a capable and admired leader, was a dangerous step towards authoritarianism. Even though Caesar's reforms brought direct benefits to the plebeians and the army, many of Rome's most influential citizens began to fear that over time he would become an impossible figure to challenge. And this created an internal dilemma for Caesar: how to balance the desire to modernize Rome without destroying the roots that still guaranteed its stability. His greatest mission, then, was not only to remain in power, but also to prove that his intentions were pure and that he was not a tyrant, but rather the key to Rome's future. However, in his search for a balance, Caesar ended up sinking deeper and deeper into a web of rivalries, distrust, and resentment that would eventually become an unbearable burden. As time passed, opposition to Caesar became increasingly bold. Although he avoided open revolt, resentment and distrust towards his rule were growing. For many senators, the answer seemed clear. If Caesar continued to concentrate so much power, the Roman Republic would be doomed. What had begun as a struggle for reform was now turning into a struggle for the survival of the Republic itself. Caesar knew that his enemies were organizing, but he could not prevent the web of conspiracy from being woven. With each step toward absolute power, he moved closer to a tragic, inevitable end. Even though he tried to please everyone, the weight of his leadership ended up creating an impossible polarization. Caesar's fate was thus sealed in the hands of those he feared most. And when the betrayal was realized, he could no longer reverse the course of his history. The shadow of death was already hanging over him, no longer as a distant rumor, but as an imminent presence. And so, the figure who seemed invincible, who reformed Rome and won the hearts of the people, had his end plotted by those who, in the shadows, decided that it was time to put an end to Caesar's era. What led him to this fate? What were the turning points that sealed his downfall? The answers to these questions echo to this day. Power, however much it is won with courage and intelligence, has its price. And in Caesar's case, that price was his own life. And so, the Battle of Thapsus was not just another victory for Caesar, but proof of his incredible strategic skill. He did not win through brute force, but through intelligence, taking advantage of the enemy's weaknesses and overcoming seemingly impossible challenges. The way he managed to turn the tide in Africa is a clear example that sometimes the greatest victories come from thinking outside the box, from using the mind to conquer when force is no longer enough. But as we reflect on all this, the question remains, in our own daily challenges, how can we learn from Caesar? Perhaps true strength lies not only in power or position, but in the ability to adapt and think strategically to win even the most difficult battles. What do you think? How do you apply this type of strategy to your life? Leave your comment and let's continue this conversation.